Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I think the next topic is going to be a fascinating discussion. The title here is Treatment versus Prevention of HIV and AIDS, and the question of identified versus statistical lives. And the other, I think, point I would like to make about this next session is it really gives you a chance to see the next generation of ethicists that are going to be carrying on the torch as those who have blazed the way here move on into retirement. So we're going to have Johann Frick, who is finishing his PhD in philosophy here at Harvard and is going to be moving on to Princeton in the spring as our speaker. And then the commentator is Eyal, who is one of our resident philosophers in the Division of Medical Ethics and Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, associate professor here at Harvard, and really been a terrific addition to our faculty. So, Johann, take it away.
Thank you. So it's said that philosophers honor each other by arguing with one another, and my talk today will not depart from this time-honored custom. But before I begin, I just wanted to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak today at this event in honor of Dan Brock. Although I've only known Dan for a little over 5 years, he's had a big influence on my development as a young philosopher, and I'm deeply grateful to him for that. It was in large part thanks to Dan and to his colleagues in the program for ethics and health that I first became interested in bioethics. And in fact, the material that I'll be presenting to you today grew out of some reflections that I prepared for a conference that Dan and his colleagues organized in Geneva back in 2010. But even more than for these valuable professional opportunities, I'm grateful to Dan for setting an example as a philosophically rigorous bioethicist, and also, I would say, as a person. Over the last 5 years, I've come to intensely admire his sharpness and clarity, his constructiveness in debate, and last but not least, the even-tempered way in which he responds to critics. And I just hope that this last point will apply to his reactions to my paper today as well. All right, so let's get started. So, for years, discussions about the best way to combat the HIV/AIDS pandemic have pitted proponents of scaling up access to antiretroviral treatment for people already suffering from AIDS against other writers who advocate in favor of a more cost-effective prevention approach, focusing on things like educational campaigns, male circumcision, condom distribution, and so on. Now, this is a very complex and fraught debate, and as a philosopher, not a public health expert, I couldn't hope to do justice to all aspects of this question. What I'll try to do today in my talk is to shed some light on the issue from one particular angle. So what I'm going to do is examine how the treatment versus prevention issue intersects and connects to another well-established debate in bioethics, namely that over identified versus statistical lives. Now, I'm by no means the first philosopher to make this connection. In a fascinating and cogently argued article, Dan Brock and Dan Wikler contend that the treatment versus prevention issue can be recast as a question about identified versus statistical lives. So in their paper, they ask, are there any moral grounds to privilege the saving of identified lives through antiretroviral treatment, even if concentrating on preventive methods could save more lives overall? And Brock and Wikler's answer to this question is a resounding no. Since all lives have equal worth, there is no sound moral basis for giving any priority to the saving of identified over statistical lives, at least all else equal. But I'm not so sure, and this is what I want to talk about today. So here's a quick outline of the talk. We'll begin by very briefly recapitulating what is the distinction between identified and statistical lives. Then very quickly summarize Brock and Wikler's main argument, I will then present a competing argument, what I call the pro-identified lives argument, which, if it is sound, would justify some degree, indeed a rather large degree, of priority being given to the saving of identified over the prevention of statistical losses of life. But as we'll see, this pro-identified lives argument is itself subject to a number of formidable objections. In order to meet these objections, I have to introduce further refinements to the view, and that will then close out the talk. All right. So, identified versus statistical lives. So it's a well-documented psychological fact that human beings have a strong propensity to attach greater salience to the saving of identified lives, often identified lives in imminent peril, over the prevention of statistical losses of lives. And by statistical lives, I just mean lives that will predictably be lost to known risk factors unless we intervene, but whose identities we cannot know, at least at present, and at many times even after the fact. We don't know which statistical losses of life we've prevented. We just know that, you know, the loss of life, the level of loss of life is lower than it would have been had we not intervened. The question is, though, is this more than an empirical, psychological fact about how human beings tend to behave? Is there any moral justification to be provided for this propensity? And Brock and Wikler, together with many other economists, lawyers, philosophers, answer no. So here's a very, very brief run through their argument. So they start with the sad but I think true factual claim that the goal of universal access to antiretroviral treatment seems unlikely to be achieved in the foreseeable future. And then they reason, given these budget constraints, we should scale back expensive antiretroviral treatment and focus instead on prevention. So they write, when resources do not permit all to be saved, it is better to save more lives than fewer, provided that the beneficiaries are chosen fairly, all other things held equal. If prevention would save more lives, it is the better choice from a moral point of view. Again, if all other things are equal. But are all other things really equal? So the strongest objection that Brock and Wikler consider their position comes from what is known as the rule of rescue. So this is the idea, as they put it, that the fact that we can save identified people whose lives are imminently threatened by AIDS creates an obligation to do so that must be honored, even if doing so reduces the number of lives saved overall. But Brock and Wikler reject the rule of rescue. So they do allow that in the role morality of patients and doctors, the role morality of doctors, this might play some role. So their relationships of trust developed through face-to-face interactions that might justify principles of non-abandonment in these contexts. But this level of face-to-face interactions between doctors and patients isn't the level at which strategic funding decisions in the global fight against HIV/AIDS have to be taken, right? And so their important claim is that the distinction between statistical and identified lives has no moral relevance for population-level bioethics, right? So they write, put most simply, statistical lives are just as real as identified lives saved, all have the same equal worth, and therefore there are no moral grounds for privileging the saving of one over the saving of the other. Now, in the following, I do not, of course, wish to dispute that statistical lives lost are equally real as identified lives lost, nor do I wish to dispute that they possess equal moral worth. What I'm not convinced by in Brock and Wikler's argument is that they've met their self-imposed argumentative burden, namely to show that shifting resources away from treatment of people currently suffering from HIV/AIDS and into prevention would not be unfair to those currently suffering. So my argument will rest on two main ideas, which I'll slowly introduce in turn. The first is an idea which moral philosophers refer to as skepticism about interpersonal aggregation. We'll talk a little about that first, and then I'll come to a second thought, namely the thought that all else equal, individuals have a strong claim to be protected, a stronger claim to be protected from a certain harm, or to have, more generally, they have a stronger claim to be protected from a harm, the greater the likelihood that they will suffer this harm. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the first idea. So there are some moral theories according to which the distinction between identified and statistical lives is clearly devoid of any moral significance, and Act-consequentialism is probably the paradigm example of such a view. So according to Act-consequentialism, as you all know, the rightness of an action is determined solely by the goodness of the state of affairs that it produces. But then the reasoning goes, if, as we admit, a statistical life is just as real as an identified life and it has just as much worth as an identified life, then surely saving a statistical life makes just as great a contribution to the goodness of an outcome that we could bring about. And then if it is furthermore the case that by focusing on statistical lives, we can save more lives overall, then we do more good by saving statistical over identified lives, and therefore that is what Act-consequentialism would have us do in such cases. But now, as you're all aware, Act-consequentialism isn't exactly an uncontroversial moral view. It's subject to many counterintuitive implications, and many of these problematic implications stem from one particular feature of the view, which moral philosophers refer to as interpersonal aggregation. So that's simply the idea that the rightness or wrongness of an action is a function not of how it affects each individual, but of the aggregate quantity of benefits and losses that it produces, right? So here's a very simple toy example just to bring out what many people find problematic about interpersonal aggregation. So call it the life versus headaches case. Suppose we can either save Fred from losing his life or prevent 1 million people from suffering a headache. So most people have the intuition that it would be wrong to let Fred lose his life in order to prevent 1 million people from suffering a headache. Indeed, many of us would make the stronger claim that no matter how large the number of headaches that we could prevent, it would still be wrong not to save Fred's life instead. Act-consequentialists, by contrast, are committed to the view that there must be some number large enough such that preventing that number of people from having a headache takes moral precedence over saving Fred's life. And as I said, that strikes many people as a problematic implication of the view. So a common non-consequentialist diagnosis for what goes wrong in Act-consequentialism in these aggregative cases is that the view fails to respect what John Rawls called the separateness of persons. So what does Rawls mean by that? Well, in a nutshell, it's this idea. Within a life, it is often rational to accept significant harms or burdens at some time in order to receive a stream of benefits at a later moment in time. And if the benefits are large enough, the idea is that intrapersonally, a person can be completely compensated for the presence of these harms in his life by the presence of great enough benefits. Rawls's crucial insight is that collections of people or groups aren't like that. They don't have the same kind of unity as single persons. They aren't super individuals. And so imposing a significant loss on one member of a group is not straightforwardly compensated for by giving a stream of benefits to other people in the group. So in other words, the relations between different persons are not like those between different temporal parts of a life. So to better capture this idea of the separateness of persons, prominent non-consequentialist philosophers, I'm thinking of Tom Nagel or Tim Scanlon, have proposed what are sometimes referred to as competing claims models of moral rightness. So according to such a competing claims model, this is a generic characterization. The precise details vary from author to author, but here's a generic characterization. An act is morally right just if it satisfies the strongest claim had by any individual person, as could be determined by a series of pairwise comparisons. So the key idea here is that different individuals do not get to combine their distinct moral claims. So this seems to work very nicely in the life versus headaches case, because of course we think Fred has a stronger individual claim to be saved from death than any single individual in the other group has to be spared a headache. So the competing claims model of rightness would yield the conclusion that it's morally right to save Fred. But now I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, I mean, what is the relevance of these reflections about something like the competing claims model for the question of identified versus statistical lives? And isn't there a crucial difference between a case like life versus headache on the one hand and the problem of identified versus statistical lives? And it's simply this. In a case like life versus headaches, what is at stake on the two sides of the trade-off are harms of very different severity. Death for Fred, whereas a mere headache for each of the million people. By contrast, and by assumption, what is at stake in identified versus statistical lives trade-offs are harms of equivalent severity, right? Death on the one hand and death on the other hand as well, right? But surely, even if we're skeptical of interpersonal aggregation, we should surely accept that saving a larger number of lives is morally required when the alternative is saving a smaller number of lives. And indeed, most non-consequentialists do indeed accept this idea, and John Torak is the most prominent extreme exception to this, but most non-consequentialists accept this idea, at least in context when it is true that what is at stake on either side of the trade-off is certain death. So if I face a choice between going to island A and saving 5 people from certain death, or going to island B and saving 1 person from certain death, then I morally required to go to island A and save the larger number of people from certain death. But it's precisely in this respect that the problem of identified versus statistical lives departs from the standard numbers problem in normative ethics. So when we save an identified person from dying, for example, from AIDS, we save someone who, but for our intervention, was certain or at least very likely to die within short order. By contrast, typically, saving a statistical life through prevention usually means slightly reducing a risk of death to many people that was already quite small to begin with, right? So it's the law of large numbers that does the work in those cases, not the fact that we greatly reduce a significant risk to any individual person. And so I claim it's this feature of the identified versus statistical lives problem that is morally important. So I claim, I assert the following risk claims principle. All else equal, individuals have a stronger claim to be spared a harm H, which they would otherwise suffer with 100% certainty or very high likelihood, than to be spared some significantly smaller risk of suffering an equivalent harm H. So just to get an intuitive feel for this principle, apply it to the following simple case, call it the 1 versus 1 case. So I think we ought to save A from certain death rather than spare B a 20% risk of death. I think no one will disagree with that, right? So note that I'm not saying that if B were unlucky and her 20% risk of death materialized, that death wouldn't be just as bad for B as death would have been for A. All I'm saying is that since B is less likely to suffer this bad fate than A, her claim to our assistance is comparatively weaker. So I've introduced these two ideas. skepticism about interpersonal aggregation, leading to the adoption of the competing claims model of moral rightness. And then the second idea that individuals have a stronger claim to be protected from certain harms than from a mere risk of harm. Now I'm going to put these two ideas together in a single argument, and this is what I call the pro-identified lives argument. So let's take a look at this. So this is on your handout if you want to read along or refer back to it later. Oh, I have here some remarks about the concept of risk that I'm operating with here, but I think I'll skip them in the interest of time. Probably Nir and I will come back to this in the discussion. But let's go straight to the pro-identified lives argument. So the first premise of the argument is just the judgment that we just now affirmed. Premise one, in the 1 versus 1 case, A has a much stronger individual claim to be saved from death than B. Okay, but now consider a modification of the case. Call it the 1 versus 5 case. So the question is, ought we to save A from certain death, so A being here an identified person, or to protect each of C, D, E, F, and G from a 20% risk of death, where if one of them ended up dying, this would be a statistical death. And I assume that the odds for each of the 5 are probabilistically independent, not correlated in any way. Okay, so it just seems true, this is my second premise, that in the 1 versus 5 case, each of C, D, E, F, and G would be treated no differently as individuals if we chose to save A than B would in the 1 versus 1 case. In other words, they would remain exposed to a 20% risk of death individually that we could have eliminated, just as would have been the case of B in the 1 versus 1 case. Okay. Then I think premises 1 and 2 together imply my third claim. In the 1 versus 5 case, none of C, D, E, F, or G have a stronger individual claim to be spared their 20% risk of death than B had in the 1 versus 1 case. And that just follows from what I've said so far. Okay, and now we bring in the second idea, the competing claims model. So according to the fourth premise, in deciding which course of action to pursue, we must not combine the claims of different individuals. Rather, the right action is the one which satisfies the strongest claim had by any individual person. But if we accept that, then together with premises 1 and 3, it just straightforwardly follows that in the 1 versus 5 case, it is right to save A, the identified individual, from certain death, rather than to spare C, D, E, F, and G a 20% risk of death, and not doing that will result in one expected statistical death, because this is what satisfies the strongest individual claim. Okay. So far, so good. But there's a problem. And I'm sure many of you have already spotted it. If the pro-identified lives argument is sound, it would provide a justification for privileging the saving of identified over statistical lives. But in a very important sense, the argument succeeds much too well, right? Because as you will have noted, its conclusion isn't at all sensitive to the number of statistical deaths that we will countenance in order to prevent one identified death. Right? So you could imagine a 1 versus 50 case, not a 1 versus 5 case, where saving the identified life A would mean accepting an expected 10 statistical deaths. And while it strikes me and many other people as intuitive that it might be right to give some measure of priority to the saving of identified over statistical lives, such that in a 1 versus 5 case or perhaps a 1 versus 8 case, we would say, save A rather than reduce the risk to the group. Surely a 1 versus 50 case is well over the line. Unfortunately, the pro-identified lives argument, as it's stated at the moment, doesn't have the resources to capture that. Right? Okay, so first attempt unsuccessful. Okay, let's consider 2 ways in which the argument might be modified in order to avoid this unpalatable conclusion. So first, there's just what you could call the consequentialist or the quasi-consequentialist view is, give up premise 4 give up the competing claims model of moral rightness and just accept that people can combine their individual claims, can pool them, and together form more weighty, collective claims, if you will. So this, I think, would solve the 1 versus 50 problem, assuming that the 50 individual claims to be spared a 20% risk of death can be together more weighty than one individual's claim to be saved from certain death. But it just reopens the old can of worms. Right now, it seems like we're back in the life versus headaches problem. Because if the weaker claims of many can together outweigh the stronger claims of one in the 1 versus 50 case, right? Why wouldn't the same be true in life versus headaches? And it doesn't seem to me like the Act-consequentialist has a good way of responding to that. So here's a second way in which the pro-identified lives argument could be challenged. So we could retain the competing claims model, so retain premise 4, and instead challenge premise 3. I'll just read premise 3 for you again. Premise 3 said, in the 1 versus 5 case, none of C to G have a stronger individual claim to be protected from their 20% risk of death than B had in the 1 versus 1 case, right? So I think what premise 3 implicitly relies on is what I call the ex-ante view, which says this: the strength of a person P's claim to be spared a risk of suffering some harm is a function of the severity of that harm, but discounted by P's ex-ante probability of suffering the harm. Okay. And now this kind of ex-ante view isn't uncontroversial. So, for example, Sophia Rybitans-Moreau, in an article called Contractualism and Aggregation, she writes, as long as we know that an action will affect someone in a certain way, we should assign that person a complaint. So she's looking at it retroactively, but we could look at it prospectively and say a claim that is based upon the full magnitude of the harm or benefit, even if we cannot identify the person in advance. So what Rybitans's suggestion amounts to is replacing the ex-ante view with what might be called the ex post view. According to this view, the strength of a person's claim to be spared a risk of harm depends not on how likely she herself is to suffer the harm. Rather, the strength of P's claim to be spared the risk of suffering that harm is a function of the severity of the harm, discounted by the chance that someone will suffer the harm. Not necessarily her herself, just someone. Okay. So replacing premise 3 of the argument with something reflecting this ex post view would solve the 1 versus 50 problem, and it would do so without getting us back into the life versus headaches problem. Unfortunately, as I'll now show, the ex post view itself is subject to problems and objections which are arguably even stronger than those that the ex ante view is subject to. There are many different ways of arguing to this conclusion. I only have time to go into one, so this is probably the most intuitive way of seeing it. So what I want to show you is that accepting the ex post view would have highly counterintuitive implications for many instances of risk that we encounter in social life. So here's one, a bioethical kind of case. Call it mass vaccination. So suppose we vaccinate 100 million children against some serious but non-fatal childhood disease. And just grant me these somewhat unrealistic assumptions. There's really no chance of dying from the disease, but it is a serious disease. So the vast majority of children will benefit from the protection that the vaccination offers. However, for every child, there's also a very remote possibility of fatal side effects from the vaccination itself. Specifically, we foresee that there will be roughly 100 statistical deaths as a result of the vaccination drive, right? So any individual child's risk of death from receiving the vaccine is 1 in a million. And the rest of the probability is that it will benefit from getting the vaccine. So we do things like this all the time, right? We often impose minute risks of very severe harms on people and on one another in pursuit of morally less significant but much more likely benefits, right? And just think about, and vaccination cases are one example, but think about speed limits on motorways, right? The speed limits could be much lower, causing us inconvenience, but predictably bringing down the level of fatalities on the roads. Now, we might argue about the precise, a speed at which the speed limit should be set, but most people agree that it's morally innocuous, that there should be some speed at which people can drive, which nonetheless will expectedly lead to a certain number of statistical deaths. So we accept risk imposition of this type in everyday life as a matter of course. But unfortunately, the ex post view isn't able to do that. So in mass vaccination, the law of large numbers allows us to predict with virtual certainty that some children will die if we vaccinate, right? And the probability of that is practically 1. By contrast, if we do not vaccinate, the worst any child will suffer is a non-fatal childhood disease. So although for any individual child, the likelihood that it will die as a result of receiving the vaccination is tiny, the ex post view prohibits us from discounting the claims of the statistical victims by their very small probability, right? So what the ex post view would tell us is just, in figuring out whether this kind of vaccination is permissible, compare an undiscounted claim of one individual against suffering the harm of death, against another person's undiscounted claim against the harm of suffering a non-fatal childhood disease. And of course, the former claim is stronger. So the ex post view concludes we must not vaccinate. So as I've already said, I think this is a counterintuitive implication and at odds with a lot of what we do in social life, but it gets worse for the ex post view. I think what's even more damaging is that the ex post view cannot tell the difference, the moral difference between the mass vaccination case we just saw and the following variation on the case, call it water supply. So imagine that everything is as in the mass vaccination case, except that this time we know in advance which children will die as a result of being vaccinated. So now we're talking about identified as opposed to statistical victims. However, the only way of vaccinating the children who will benefit is by vaccinating those who will be harmed as well. Assume, I'm a philosopher, so I get to make these kind of fanciful assumptions. Assume that the only way of distributing the vaccine to any child is by putting it in the general water supply that all children must drink from. Oops. So I think it's clear there is a moral difference between these two cases, right? Water supply would amount to sacrificing the lives of a small number of identified children to spare others the burden of a non-fatal childhood disease. That seems morally much more problematic than what we do in mass vaccination. The ex-ante view can capture this difference, right? A proponent of the ex-ante view could say, well, it is very simple to see where this moral difference comes from. In mass vaccination, we can say to each child, to the very best of our knowledge, giving you in particular this vaccine is likely to turn out for your own benefit. And there's only a minuscule chance that you will suffer as a result of receiving the vaccine. This is precisely what we cannot say to every child in a case like water supply. And so the ex-ante view, by discounting harms by their ex-ante likelihood of occurring, can capture this. By contrast, the ex-post view implies that vaccinating is impermissible in both cases, and equally impermissible. And incidentally, Act-consequentialism faces the same problem in reverse. So if the Act-consequentialist says vaccination is permissible because of its good aggregate consequences in mass vaccination, he'd be committed to saying the same in the water supply case as well. And this, again, strikes us as implausible. So I think what goes wrong with both the ex post view and Act-consequentialism is that they conflate the moral significance of the following two propositions. One, it is certain that some children will die if we vaccinate. And two, there are some children who are certain to die if we vaccinate. Right? So according to both views, as long as we know that one is true, we don't have to care about whether it's true or not. Whereas I've just argued that whether two is true or not makes a crucial moral difference. Okay. So this is where we stand. As we've just seen, Act-consequentialism and the ex-post view, which treat the loss of identified and statistical lives as morally on a par, they're both problematic because they can't tell the difference between a case like mass vaccination and a case like water supply. On the other hand, as we saw before, a competing claims model that operates with the ex-ante view is also problematic because it seems to give the wrong reply to a case like 1 versus 50. Right. So is there a way out of this impasse? I think there is, by adopting what I call a pluralist view. So I say we should retain the competing claims model and indeed retain the competing claims model plus the ex-ante view. I think this is necessary in order to capture the difference between mass vaccination and water supply. But we have to reconceptualize what the competing claims model is really getting at, right? Traditionally, the thought was that the competing claims model offers an account of what we ought to do, all things considered, right? And this is, I think, the claim that we have to revise. So I want to say the competing claims model captures not what it is right for action, not what is for actions to be right, all things considered. Rather, it captures a particular, an important species of pro tanto reasons, which contribute to making actions right or wrong, but which aren't the only thing that matters. So specifically, I want to say the moral ideal that finds expression in the ex-ante version of the competing claims model is one of fairness or equity. These might not be ideal labels. We can talk about that later. But it just seems to me that it is unfair to let Fred lose his life so that other people may be spared the much smaller harm of a headache. And likewise, in the 1 versus 5 case, it seems unfair to leave A exposed to certain death so that others may avoid a much smaller risk of death. However, in deciding what to do, all things considered, fairness isn't our only concern. Right? Sometimes fairness, reasons of fairness have to be traded off against other concerns. For instance, what I call well-being given reasons, so a concern for the outcome characterized in terms of people's well-being. I think combining these two types of pro tanto reasons in a single pluralist view gives superior results to both a pure ex-ante view or a pure act-consequentialist view. So I think giving fairness its due means that in a case like 1 versus 5, where the actions do not differ in terms of their expected consequences in terms of well-being, we should do what is fair and save A, the burden of certain death. Likewise, when the two options don't differ by much in terms of their expected consequences, like in the 1 versus 8 case, I think reasons of fairness can prove decisive. By contrast, in a case like 1 versus 50, I think any pro tanto reason to be concerned with fairness, which is still there, is nonetheless swamped or outweighed by a concern with well-being. It says goodness here, but it should say well-being. This is important. So I think we should, in those cases, prevent the greater loss of statistical lives, just because there's so much more well-being at stake. Okay, so I think it's time to return to the implications of this discussion for the HIV/AIDS debate. So I think if my arguments are sound, Brock and Wikler are wrong to claim that given the equal worth of all human lives, there could be no morally relevant difference between saving identified lives through treatment or averting loss of statistical lives through prevention. Because, again, if we do not treat people already suffering from AIDS, they will soon die with certainty or at least a very high likelihood. By contrast, failing to take all preventive efforts means that currently uninfected people will have a somewhat higher risk of contracting and dying from AIDS, but this risk is well below 100%, probably in most countries even below the 20% figure that I was working with in my examples. So therefore, if people do have a stronger claim to be protected from certain death and to have their risk of death further reduced, I think reasons of fairness would give would support some degree of preference being given to the saving of identified over statistical lives. But of course, how heavily this consideration of fairness should weigh with us will depend, first of all, on just how large the discrepancy in terms of well-being is between what can be achieved by focusing on identified and what can be achieved by focusing on statistical lives. And secondly, it will also depend on the moral question, just how heavily to weight considerations of fairness as opposed to considerations of well-being. Now, unfortunately, I cannot give you a precise algorithm for conducting this weighing, but nor do I think it's my role to do so, right? I think the role of moral philosophy is to inform moral judgment by calling our attention to what are morally relevant factors in a situation. Our role isn't to abolish the need for moral judgment. So this is all I'm going to say about this question. Okay, I'll end my talk by mentioning one important wrinkle in the story I've told you so far. So, as I've told it so far, the dichotomy between treatment and prevention seems to map neatly onto the distinction between identified and statistical lives. But in reality, things might be more complicated. So here's one potential complication. There are two things we might mean by focusing on treatment. We might mean using the money and resources that we currently have at our disposal to treat people currently suffering from AIDS. Or we might mean a distinct second thing, namely using the resources at our disposal to invest in the means to treat people suffering from AIDS at some point in the future. So here's one last case that brings out the significance of this difference. I call it policymakers' trilemma. So suppose a health policymaker must decide between the following three ways of spending the funds available to his district for fighting AIDS. First is what I call present treatment. So spend all available funds to save the lives of 500 identified persons currently suffering from AIDS in his district. Second option I call future treatment. Spend all available funds to enable better treatment in the future. So this, we predict, will foreseeably allow the health system to save 600 lives in the future, but these resources will come online too late to benefit the present sufferers, present identified sufferers. They'll all die in the meanwhile. Third option, prevention. So spend all available funds on prevention, reducing the number of people in the district who will contract and die from AIDS in the future. And this, let's assume, will save 750 lives. But again, nothing will be done for the present identified sufferers of AIDS, and they'll all die. So I've argued so far, contra Brock and Wikler, that although prevention may maximize a number of lives saved, there's at least something to be said for present treatment, right? There's a pro tanto reason of fairness to go for present treatment, though I haven't committed myself to just how strong it is. But now let's imagine present treatment isn't an option. It's just not available in this case. And so the case reduces to a two-way choice between future treatment on the one hand and prevention on the other. Now, in that case, all lives that we can save through either method are statistical lives from the present perspective. So I think in this case, choosing prevention is both optimistic in terms of well-being given reasons, and it minimizes everyone's ex-ante risk of death. So this is clearly the option that we should choose, and there's no objection of unfairness to that choice. So that just illustrates the importance of temporal structure in thinking about the issue of treatment versus prevention. I think that's all I have time for, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Is this how I operate this?
I don't know.
Okay.
If it doesn't, use the keys.
Well, yeah. There you go. That is not just an alpha bioethicist. He's also somebody who was, for so many of us, a great, great mentor. And starting, with in Brown and NIH, and in recent years we have postdocs here, and visitors to the program in ethics and health, and medical students and health policy students. There was Dan's room has a glass door, and mine is located in such an angle that I can assure you that there seemed to be almost at all times somebody there talking to him about something, getting something out of that conversation. He stood up in that respect for two qualities. One that a bunch of people have mentioned earlier today and also last night, Dan's openness to opposing views. Dan was not in the business that so many mentors are of cloning the next, cloning little Dans, although looking around this room you might be mistaken, looking at Dan Wikler and Norm Daniels and Dan Hausman. He was delivering Johanns who disagree with him, and that is really remarkable once you see the real world of academia. Dan was also the agreeable mensch that he is, which stands out. If you know the philosophical world, it's not a trivial thing for a philosopher to be so agreeable in the way that Dan is, which made conversations so nice, I bet, for all of these people in that room, and we all are very grateful for that. Johann's wonderful, wonderful talk and wonderful paper, you haven't read it, argue. I'll try to simplify the sort of bottom lines for us. First, as I understand him, and he will correct me if I'm just wrong there, that other things being equal, there is some limited priority to individuals who are identified as higher risk than others simply because they are higher risk than those others. They have a stronger claim on us for assistance, and that counts somewhat. That makes attending to their needs somewhat more urgent, other things being equal. He also says, other things being equal, treatment, for example, in the context of HIV/AIDS, is more relevant to individuals who are identified as higher risk than is prevention. So, he concludes, other things being equal, treatment, for example, in the context of AIDS, commands somewhat greater urgency. I'll examine and say something critical about premises 1 and 2, and we'll see where that leaves us. So let's start with 1. So this is a repetition. I'll start by specifying a little more what I think this continues the exegesis part, and I hope that Johann will continue, if he agrees so far that this was representing correctly, that he will continue to agree with me about a fair representation. Johann is speaking about a particular notion of risk, which is both epistemic and non-kitsch. What do I mean by epistemic? Suppose my doctor, based on the best evidence, my doctor is a wonderful doctor, she orders lab tests, and she concludes that I have a malign tumor, that I'm at very high risk of dying within a year. That doesn't mean that I'm at very high risk of dying within the year. There is also the question, objectively, am I? So yeah, she made her best efforts to find out the answer. And it may be the case that objectively, not epistemically, according to what she believes may be best, based on the best evidence, objectively, I have a different kind of tumor. It's quite benign. It's located in an okay spot. And I'm at low risk of dying within the year. In fact, objectively, it might be the case that in our fairly Laplacian world, it's already in my cards that I will survive the year. So I'm at 100% non-risk. I'm at 0% risk of dying within the year, objectively. So let's distinguish between these epistemic senses of risk and more objective conceptions of risk. Johann started out this work thinking that when he focuses on risk, when we're talking here about people who are at high risk, he should be focused on the more objective notions of risk. And I think around 2011 maybe, after that was in 2009, 10, then 2011 maybe came a change, and he jumped ship to focusing on epistemic notions of risk. So this is really about what somebody believes, or somebody believes based on the best evidence, or somebody should believe based on the best evidence, things of that sort. he is emphatic, and also Norm Daniels, whose view I think resembles Johann's a lot on these matters, is certainly emphatic, that when they talk about identified persons, this is not about things like, well, this is my patient, the other one is not my patient, or I see the person's face, they look me in the eye, and I don't see the face of the other person, or I know this person's story, and the other person, I don't know how many children they have. Here I have a very concrete flesh and blood. That's not it. It's a more philosophical notion for Norm and for Johann, and that is part of what makes them less vulnerable to the response, oh, you're just succumbing to some psychological fallacy that has to do with our face-to-face interactions or something like that. They're saying if somebody is deemed epistemically, at least according to Johann, to be at high risk, that just translates immediately into a claim. This is not about whether this touches us emotionally or anything of that sort. Having tried to clarify that, I want to ask, though, another question. When we talk about identified epistemically in the eyes of somebody, according to the evidence available to them, to others, we should be asking in the eyes of whom? Are we talking about, for example, in this context, two salient protagonists or salient kinds of protagonists? Or one is the people competing for the assistance, and another is the allocator. So the patients and the doctor, for example, in the HIV/AIDS example. There is a lot recommending a focus on the identified, the people who are competing for the benefit, for the assistance. You might think if they believe I'm at high risk and there will be no assistance to me, they lose hope, or they have to make some crazy expensive investments in insurance, or maybe they will complain, and that kind of counts from the point of view of one understanding of an ethics of trying to prevent people from having just complaints. But I think none of this can work because of the possibility of rigging things against them without them knowing. So suppose the allocator is really nepotistic or really racist, and they want to discriminate against one of the parties and in favor of their chums, then they could be using, say, a rigged coin to decide the matter. But surely this uneven coin that the candidates don't know is uneven is not a paradigm of fair allocation of goods. The fact that they don't know that they are at high risk because the coin is rigged against one of them doesn't salvage the fairness of the decision. So I think that we shouldn't be focusing on epistemic risk as assessed by the people who want the assistance. If anything, it should be as assessed or as should be assessed or something like that by the allocator. But here there is also, I think, a complication, which I'll expand on the next slide. I think the most pertinent case is the second one of the two that I'll present. I see the first one as more of a kind of build-up, though maybe based on the conversation that Johann and I had last night, maybe even we would have some disagreements about the first case. But let's talk about, Francis is here, we'll make it a trolley case. So there's a runway trolley. It's headed towards a fork on the track, which branches into 100 branches, on each of which, unfortunately, a person is tied. And you don't know towards which it's heading. It will head towards one of them. You're a passerby. You see the situation. You know that it's heading towards one of them. There will be a victim. You don't know which it's going to be. The only thing you could do, there's no fat man in this story, nothing you could do to stop the trolley. The only thing you could do is to activate your quantum roulette. We are talking philosophy today. That will reassign this objectively high risk randomly, really, really randomly, according to the strictest conceptions of what counts as random, really randomly. It's a quantum system such that it becomes an open question who will get that kind of trolley hitting them. That's the only thing you could do. Instead of one particular person, it's going to be somebody. Maybe that person, but probably 99% somebody else. It comes with a little cost to do that. You were actually just on your way to bring an anti-pain medication to the neighbor's child. Child is suffering, they have a headache, they don't understand what's happening with their head. And if you do this thing, it's going to cost the child another few minutes of suffering. Does the fact that you have no clue which branch this is heading to, you couldn't because you don't see. Does the fact that there would be this randomization going on in the world, does that incline you to let the child suffer for another 10 minutes from the headache? Let's do a little show of hands. Okay, so you have two possibilities. One is to activate the roulette with the little cost of the child suffering. And the other one is not to activate the roulette, to rush to the child and relieve them of their headache. Who would activate the roulette? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14. Okay. Who would not activate the roulette? Okay, a clear majority. I'm not sure that this counts at all against Johann's argument. Here's the kind of the case that I think may count against him. In this case, there is a little sign that says it's going to be branch 31. That's it. No kitsch. You don't see the face of the person. You've never, maybe they're behind a hill and you have no, it just says it's going to be branch number 31. Is this a difference big enough, the fact that there is a sign saying it's going to be branch number 31, to make the majority change their minds and this time round let the child suffer from the headache because of some difference? So let's have a quick show of hands. Who would, in this case, activate the roulette? Maybe a little fewer. I think that's the bias of having had a vote before. And who would not activate the roulette? All right, again, a clear majority. Given how I frame things now, I think that case number 2 is the sort of case that Johann, then maybe even based on the conversation last night, maybe even case number 1, but certainly case number 2 is a case where if Johann were right, then the right decision would have been we have to activate the roulette. Why? Because there is somebody identified as, that's the person in 31 who is identified as it's going to happen on their backs. And if you were thought through this well, you would have to say that little headache of the child, yes, it counts some. It's not an other things being equal example. But compared to fairness on life and death matters, probably you would have had to say that kind of pales in comparison. We should just activate the raffle machine. So that makes me think that we should question Johann's premise number 1, namely that being a person identified in that epistemic non-kitsch sense as high risk gives you a stronger claim to be assisted, other things being equal, if we're talking about a substantially stronger claim. Okay, so let's focus, let's create some complications regarding claim number 2 that says other things being equal, treatment, for example, for HIV/AIDS is more relevant to individuals identified as higher risk than is prevention. Again, we're talking about the same conception of risk. I want to suggest that the treatment versus prevention distinction doesn't map quite as elegantly as Johann and perhaps even Dan and Dan portrayed it as mapping onto this issue of identified versus statistical victims. So I'm just going to complicate it a bit. For example, the way we treat the worms is we don't need to identify who has the worm and who doesn't. Teacher comes to class, gives all the children a pill that with a single dose kills the worms, and it has such non-serious side effects, and it costs so little that we don't bother testing them and checking who has it and give it only to them. We just give it to everybody. Imagine that in the future we would have something like that for HIV/AIDS when antiretrovirals become way more benign than they are now, far fewer side effects, nausea, etc. Much, much, much cheaper than they are now. Maybe we would think, I'm not thinking about kind of test and treat where we do it to prevent infection. I'm talking here about a kind of pure treatment concerned issue. We might say at some point, why do we need to test people? It's so hard to get people to test. Let's just give it to them. It might, if everybody gets it, it might reduce stigma, it improve adherence. It might work out that way. I'm a philosopher. We are allowed to talk about such sci-fi events. In such a situation, treatment wouldn't map onto we identified who has it. There's also a complication about prevention. Some forms of prevention, secondary prevention, will be applied to people who are already at elevated risk compared to the general population. I think that this point in particular doesn't challenge anything substantial in what Johann says. I'm just mentioning it to say that there is kind of things are a little complicated. But the third point I think does challenge something which in a way that makes kind of practical difference. When the decision is taken about allocating resources between treatment and between prevention, say in the context of HIV, it's not always taken by a party who, at that point at least, knows who needs prevention and who needs treatment. It's not taken at the point where we have identified some people as at high risk, or at least that party, that third party often, doesn't necessarily have that information. So think about a donor who is thinking about whether to emphasize one or emphasize the other in their funding scheme. They are not clinicians. It would have been inappropriate for them to know who has it and to somehow allocate on that basis. So from the point of view of that third party, they have to think of everybody as unidentified because they are not identified to them and they shouldn't be identified to them. Johann mentioned the issue of the advanced, the temporal issue, and that is important as well. Seems to me that if Johann were consistent with what he says there, he should have supported not exactly the Dan and Dan policy, not the policy that would make Paul happy, of kind of continuing to emphasize throughout treatment, but a sort of odd halfway house solution. He would maybe have to say, treat everybody who at this point in time have been identified, have showed up in our clinics as high risk, but say nothing for the next infections. So from now on, tough luck for you. So maybe we should have met at one point in the early 90s, said, okay, we'll grandfather in the people who are already infected, but from now on, we are not identifying these people. We will bind ourselves institutionally to a policy that would maximize cost effectiveness in the long run. If that translated into prevention, then so be it. To end this, I will emphasize all of this is just about, for those of you who come here because they're interested in HIV/AIDS, this is just about one argument in this kind of complex debate. Paul has mentioned this morning other arguments that would support emphasis on treatment. There are still other arguments. I'll mention just one. The sheer fact that there is stronger psychological inclination in the population, among the voters, among the donors, to emphasize treatment means, I think that's what Jim Kim often calls the Lazarus effect. it means that we are in a much better position when it comes to treatment to get money from donors, from governments for HIV/AIDS. You could put it in the following way. The cost of treatment is often negative because it generates funds. Surely that must be taken into consideration, and therefore instrumentally setting aside completely the sort of kitsch or anything else that affects us psychologically is not something that we should do when we plan policy. So, and there are many other arguments. We could focus today either on kind of the broader discussion or on the philosophical point. Just to repeat, I love that paper. It's really a treat for all of us to see people like Johann emerging and doing such fantastic work. So, thank you.
Nir and Johann, yes, please come on up here.
I just want to show one more slide.
Okay.
In response. So thanks a lot, Nir. This was really great and very interesting what you said. And I'll take 3 or 4 minutes to respond to some of Nir's points. And first of all, I completely agree with the last thing that Nir said. So if there are endogeneities or feedback loops such that focusing on treatment will expand the budget because people are more willing to give to HIV strategies that have these very visible, spectacular effects, Lazarus effect, and so on, then that is something to be taken into consideration, of course. I bracketed that in my presentation by having this all else equals clause, right? So I'm leaving aside these kinds of effects, but of course they matter. So that would further strengthen the case for treatment over prevention in some of these scenarios. But okay, to the main substance of Nir's remarks, I just wanted to say 2 things. So I said earlier I skipped 2 slides about the concept of risk and chance that I was working with in my talk. So Nir's right, it is indeed an epistemic conception of chance. So what I mean when I say, a person has a 20% risk of suffering some harm is indeed, given the available evidence, a rational degree of credence that this person will suffer the harm is something like 0.2. And Nir is also right that I think it's these epistemic chances as opposed to objective probabilities that matter to the strength of people's claims and to the issue of justifiability. So why do I think that? First of all, is everyone clear about the distinction between epistemic and objective? So objective chances would only arise if there was indeterminacy at the level of laws of nature. So if what will happen in a given scenario is genuinely indeterministic, even at the physical level, only then would there be an objective chance greater than 0 but smaller than 1, right? By contrast, if we live in a deterministic world or a physical reality, at least at the level that we're concerned with in these medical cases is deterministic, then there would only be epistemic chances owed to our ignorance. We might know the laws of nature, but we don't know the precise starting conditions, or we know the starting conditions, but we don't know the precise laws of nature. And it would only be owed to this ignorance that there would be epistemic chances between 0 and 1. Okay, so now the question is, why focus on epistemic as opposed to objective chances? And I just have 2 points to make. First, let's look at the question in a forward-looking sense. So say someone is exposed to a 20% epistemic risk of death. But we don't know whether we're in an indeterministic scenario where this 20% risk of death corresponds to a genuine 20% objective chance of dying and an 80% objective chance of living. Or are we in a deterministic scenario where a 20% epistemic chance corresponds to a 20% epistemic chance of it being objectively certain that you're going to die, and an 80% epistemic chance of it being objectively certain, determined that you will live, right? And now just ask yourself, is it rational to have any preference about which scenario we're in? Is it rational to be exposed to an epistemic, to the deterministic or the indeterministic scenario? And I just think there's no good reason to prefer to be in one scenario than in the other. What we have self-interested reasons for caring about ex ante is just our expected utility, the expected utility that the eventual outcome will give us, and that is the same across both scenarios. So I say in this forward-looking sense, we have no reason to care. And now think about it in the backward-looking case. So we've already died, or we've already been harmed, and the question is, would it have been any better for us if we'd been in the indeterministic as opposed to the deterministic scenario? So you could say, well, I ended up dying, but in the indeterministic scenario, well, at least I had a 20% objective chance of surviving. Does that in any way make things better for you? And again, I think the answer is no. So this is my reason for focusing on epistemic as opposed to objective chance. And so I think this bears on Near's trolley case 1, where I don't think there is any reason to operate the quantum lottery because we're already in a situation where epistemic chances are equally distributed. There's now no reason to add this further layer of objective chances as well. It's not necessary. Then one other thing. Quickly. Yeah, very quickly. So I simplified somewhat in the talk by distinguishing only between identified and statistical lives. I think in reality this is a non-exhaustive distinction, and there's at least room for a third category, which we could call identifiable lives. So these are lives whose identities we don't currently know, but which, given available evidence, we could easily come to know, for example, through a medical test or something like that. So I think that such cases are to be treated as morally similar to cases involving identified lives, and not like the statistical lives. And so you could just imagine, take my water supply case where there are these people who are certain to die if we give them the vaccine, and now just make it the case that we know this, and it's because of some gene that our medical scientists have identified. It's just that we haven't yet run the test to know who has the gene and who hasn't. But we could easily do that. I think in such a case, taking ignorance of the identity of the eventual victims as any kind of justification for giving them the vaccine would be a very poor excuse, right? It's just not true that to the very best of our knowledge, these people, the vaccine had a chance of benefiting everyone, because it didn't. And we could have easily found that out in such cases. So that's how I deal with Near's worm case in the classroom. But okay, I'll stop there because I already spoke a lot and want other people.
All right. Thanks to you both. Fascinating discussion. I can imagine that our conversation will operate on a couple of levels here. One will be aspects of the philosophical distinctions themselves. Another will be how this actually would play out in the real-life issues around HIV/AIDS, and I hope we'll get to both. So, Marcia, no, please, because I'd like you to come up to the microphone. So if you'd like to go first, please do. And then Marcia next.
I wanted to ask, in your last slides have sort of gotten to this point. I don't think either, so I agree the timing of when information is available is critical to the identified versus statistical distinction. And in terms of aggregating across people, another way you can think of this is the people's own preferences ex ante before they're identified. Yeah. And neither of you really spoke about that very clearly, but what role does that have? Because the ex ante procedures might honor the Pareto principle, whereas the ex post might not.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. I was talking about, in my final case, the policymaker's trilemma. I said, let's now imagine a case where any treatment resources we develop won't benefit people currently suffering from HIV/AIDS, but only people who contract the disease in the future. So whoever will contract AIDS in the future doesn't currently know that they will require treatment at some point. So I said, here is indeed in every person's ex ante interest that instead of spending our resources on deploying these future treatment possibilities, we should instead be focused on prevention. And precisely for the kind of ex ante Pareto reason that you that you mentioned. I would just say, in response to one other thing that Nir said, that I would not exclude people currently suffering from HIV/AIDS but not identified as suffering in the group of statistical victims. As I just said, I think that the morally more relevant difference is between identified and identifiable people on the one hand and statistical people whose identities we just cannot know at present on the other. But aside from that, I'm completely on board with
Let me
this.
just say about the identifiable. That's partly why I tried to be careful and say the donors, as a matter of principle, should not be identified. So in a sense, they're not identifiable to the donors because we don't want the donors knowing who has it and who doesn't. It's not their job, they're not their clinicians. And I also want to mention a point in response to what you said earlier. As far as I can see, the response is, what I focus on is not the indeterminism but the epistemic point, and the response about the difference between identified and identifiable can't really address the variant number 2 that I mentioned. So in that variant, so that's why that's the one that I focus on. Yeah. In that variant, it is not, so you have two choices. Either, yeah, you can make it very indeterministic and everything, but also unknown to you, whereas now you fully, you have full knowledge of it's 31, and yet the intuitions don't necessarily go the way you want it to go.
Okay, Marcia.
I liked your talk very much, Johann, and I particularly liked your argument against interpersonal aggregation. I'm with you on Fred. There were a couple of assumptions in all of this, and some of them are just philosophical license, but that I would like to question. You started out talking about a defined population with a defined pot of money that could go either to prevention or treatment. Highly artificial. In most societies, both go on. They are not mutually exclusive. You have public health, you have clinical medicine, and so forth. And I would make an argument that they both should go on. Fred, you have a duty to rescue him from suffering, and that's a different argument from the well-being of the particular population. The second artificial thing that I would like to point out more strongly, all morning we have used the term cost and the term price used interchangeably. In fact, we haven't heard the term price. It's all been about cost, as though this were some kind of a natural phenomenon. They are very different, and the terms should be used precisely. And I think when we do use those terms precisely, we find some problems with the argumentation. In this case, the assumption has been that, prevention is cheaper than treatment. Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. The price of treatment is usually higher than the price of prevention. That's not the same thing as cost. And Paul Farmer may have something to say on that issue. So I would strongly urge that in all conversation in this forum about rationing, prevention versus treatment, we distinguish price from cost.
Right, Larry? Oh, sorry. Francis, sorry, didn't see you there.
Can I say a word on
Yeah,
the
please.
price and cost? One way to underwrite the point is to say, really what you're talking about is kind of price effectiveness calculation as opposed to cost effectiveness calculation, meaning you're checking how much it would cost you because of the prices charged by the manufacturers, but the price is, as we know, very artificial. First priority should be to fight for getting the prices closer to the cost or making the prices fair. I agree with that. There still remains a third possibility than simply focusing on the real cost when we make the calculations, which is to focus on the price as it likely will be after we're done doing all the fighting that with our limited power we can wage against these very powerful charges of high prices. And there are two philosophical possibilities. One, the ideal theory possibility is it should have been really the cost, and I'm going to continue to assume unrealistically that the price of treatment is its cost. Or another philosophical possibility is to be realistic, to be a non-ideal theorist, and to say I'm not going to idealize, I'm going to predict how successful I'm going to be in that fight. And if I continue to predict, the price is going to be somewhat cheaper if I fight hard, but probably not completely as cheap as it should be, then I'm going to assume that price. And it's possible that if we were a realist like that, we will have to continue to ascribe treatment a far lower cost effectiveness than for some preventative interventions, such as male circumcision.
Of course, Marcia. But please use the microphone.
Language and rhetoric matter. And everything we're talking about here today is, should we do this or should we do that? And you can't suddenly say, well, we can't get the drug companies to stop making out like bandits. We can't go there. That's unrealistic. We can do all this other stuff. But we can't say that the marginal cost of drugs is zero in most cases. You can't say that because that's just too big to take on, but we can take on all this other stuff. Come on, Near. So I just think we have to remember what the issues are. The rhetoric matters, the language matters.
Yeah. I found the comments on the paper very, very stimulating. I have many questions, but one I want to ask Johann is, you were quick to say that if we were unfair, unfairness is a pro tanto reason, but it can be overridden by 50 lives. That was the figure you gave. And my sense is that, first of all, if I were to tell people in this room, tell someone, I'm treating you unfairly in a very severe way, such that you will die. You will die, and I will be treating unfairly in letting that happen. We will then save 50 people's lives. I'm not sure that that would be the right answer, that it would be swamped. We certainly think that in the case of rights, we're not going to kill one person to save 50 people. Question of justice, right? And I want to know why you think that fairness should be given so much less weight than the claim of justice and rights. I can see many distinctions, but I'm not sure that the number 50 is where the line should be drawn.
Okay. Yeah, so I do think in the case that you started describing, Francis, it sounded to me like there was more of a rights-based as opposed to a fairness-based objection to treating this one person in this horrible way. Perhaps that tracks to some extent a distinction between a case where we impose on some innocent person some harm in order to provide benefits to other people, as opposed to the cases that I was talking about here, where the choice is between providing a kind of benefit for members of two distinct groups which differ in number. So why would a rights-based yeah, that's right. So why would a rights-based objection be more serious than a fairness-based objection? I mean, I just think that the notion of rights itself involves them being, at least up to a certain threshold, trumps and exclusionary reasons vis-a-vis other types of reasons, right? To say that A has a right to not be interfered with in some way means that at least up to a certain threshold, considerations of other kinds, such as the well-being type reasons that I was talking about, should not come into the decision whether to treat A in this way or not, right? And I'm not sure that reasons of fairness have the same kind of exclusionary structure in these cases as, well, and again, I mean, we'd have to be more concrete and talk about, that's a very, it's, okay, thank you, yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, let's have 3 more before lunch. So, Paul?
Yeah, excuse me for not standing. Thank you very much, both of you, and Norm and Dan and others who've written about this. The point I was going to make was made by Marcia, and I think the fetishization of price is just such a critical matter for all of these discussions, and now we have so much information about all that's gone on before. And again, I'm not just talking about HIV disease, but plenty of other. I mean, just take any chemotherapeutic agent or vaccine, HPV vaccine. I mentioned looking forward that this is exactly what we're facing around hepatitis C treatment. And it just would be great to catch up ahead of time, not just epidemiologically, clinically, but also in terms of moral philosophy. I think it would be really infuse the debate with important matters. But I haven't, since Marcia said all that, I'm just going to make 2 other points that are really important, I believe, as well, and like to be part of your exercise, Johann, because it's an important issue to this day. The first one is that in addition to fetishizing cost, we've also fetishized effectiveness. We don't have a vaccine for HIV. It's not like polio vaccine. If I said to you that gender inequality, poverty, and labor migration were the leading risk factors for HIV, and the further south you go on the continent that's most afflicted, I think I'd be right. And so where's the prevention for that? And so the methods of prevention that we've fetishized, educate, there's 7 or 8 of them that there's a reason they get elevated, and it's not always tied to whether or not they're effective for those most at risk. And that needs to be interrogated by all of you. We don't have reliable ways of preventing HIV in spite of claims to the contrary, and we have some that are pretty good. Send someone off to a convent or something, maybe. But there's very few, really, that are reliable, especially among those most at risk. So the prevention versus treatment distinction was always problematic, as it was with tuberculosis, as it is with teenage pregnancy. Go right down the list. And I think that's something that we have a lot of information about, not in infectious disease. By the way, most of the people we're talking about, even those benefiting from treatment, are not going to ever see a doctor in their life. So it's not the proximity to a physician that has altered their fate so radically that the 7 million or so people who are receiving therapy. I'm not sure that I understand kitsch, and I want to ask more about that word. I thought it was bad art, and I just was sitting there thinking, as a friend of mine said, God really loves the poor, he just hates their art. So I want to know if that effective connection is what you meant by kitsch, and how it works is a serious sociological challenge for us too. And the second point, and then I'd like to ask about what could be done in terms of these models that I understand come from philosophy and are less familiar to some of us. I have to admit I don't understand all the Latin terms either. I'm going to learn them though, that were used today. Ex ante I kind of get. And that is, in talking, and you I think corrected this, Johann, you talked about temporality.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems, and the reason that treatment activism has been so important around this particular disease and will be safe around breast cancer in low, whatever we want to call them, low and middle income countries. By the way, that's where the biggest burden of cancer is, in poor countries. Those people are invisible. They're non-persons because they're not statistically or whatever term, they're not being really counted in a way that would alter their fates post being sick with an illness. And that's what Johannes Fabian calls a denial of coevalness, right? We're pretending like this is a different planet or not you, but I'm saying when we talk about prevention versus care, as Marsha said, these things happen in the same societies. And so really talking about the idea that these people are on a different time frame, and that, that term denial of coevalence will strike any treatment activist as true, regardless of what the pathology in question might be.
Any response, or can...
I was hoping for a response.
Do you want to go?
I just, in response to the fetishization of price objection, I do not have any disagreement with what you say here, right? And I think that insofar as the pricing practices of pharmaceutical companies are unjust, this is a very important issue that deserves normative scrutiny in its own right? I just think that there still is a case to be made for division of intellectual labor and philosophy, that we can examine this problem about unjust pricing practices, and then we can examine the residual problem in its own right. And it's the latter that I was trying to do today. But I don't want to be misunderstood in any way as neglecting the importance of this fetishization point that the two of you made. I also agree. I mean, you said we don't just fetishize price, but also effectiveness, right? Perhaps the most effective interventions aren't these piecemeal, meliorative campaigns, but rather wholesale political reform and so on. It's not clear to what extent those can be imposed through some external agency. I think those are also valid points, and points that proponents of prevention in particular would have to take on board, right? My aim today was not to defend prevention, right? So I think those kinds of critiques would be more correctly directed at a proponent of prevention. I was saying, let's just give the proponents of prevention all they claim, right? The best case scenario for their view, and still we will see that there are certain objections to their arguments, right? So it's in a way this generosity in assuming that most of what your opponent says is true, which makes your argument all the more powerful if nonetheless you can show that there's certain problems with the argument. So it was that kind of strategy that I was pursuing today.
When I understood that, I just was saying, I'm a prevention advocate. I think
Yeah.
you don't, it's the fetishization of the opposition that you were undermining. You were saying that's not how it works. And
Yeah.
we have so much empiric data about that now that I think would be helpful.
Well, I'm going to take just 5 more minutes, and there'll still be plenty of time for lunch. But it's a good discussion. So.
No word on coevalence, or?
Go ahead, Nir. Sure.
Okay, thanks. So I think that's an important point, which actually touches on the philosophical issue of whether, when we're trying to achieve fairness, we should focus on the level of risk or on the distribution of outcomes, personal outcomes, having had a bad life, a good life, a healthy life, an unhealthy life. And here's what I have in mind. If you went Norm's or Johann's way and focused on the distribution of chance, you might say, whenever I can identify a group, the Canadians, the South Africans, doesn't make much difference, as higher risk for something, that is already for me an unfairness. It's from the point of view of that factor at least, it's as unfair if it happens in Canada or in Southern Africa. And if you take into account, if you want to take seriously the concern about the fact that it's the same populations that tend to be badly off in one respect, badly off in another respect, badly off in the third respect, then you might have to accept that at least one independent concern for fairness is the fairness in the distribution of the outcomes, not so much of the risk exposure. And the idea would be as follows. And I'm an egalitarian, I believe in equality, but I don't believe that the currency for my what I'm trying to equalize should be something like chances or risks. I believe that what I should try to equalize is good lives, bad lives, things like that. And here's why this is, I think, underwriting an approach such as mine, a sort of ex-post egalitarian approach. When you have one society where a lot of the bad stuff of various kinds is concentrated, you'll have many instances, as a statistical matter, of individuals who are badly off in housing, badly off also in other, whereas, so there's inequality in housing, mount on top of that the inequality in one disease, the inequality in a third disease, etc. There will be many instances of people who are badly off in many ways, so there will be steeper Gini. There will be more inequality in outcomes in such a world than if it were a world where, we'll take the HIV risk, you'll take the housing risk, etc. And from a certain point of view that focuses on ex post distributions, that is particularly unfair.
Larry.
Thanks. So Johann, liked your paper a lot, liked your response a lot as well. Want to raise a question that you are going to be aware of already. So I like the kind of position you have, the anti-additive aggregationist approach. I call that the dispersed additional burdens view, as you know.
Yeah.
You raise this issue of temporality, but there's another issue of temporality, as you know, and that's the problem of iteration. There's always an issue of individual versus collective decision making, and there's an issue of making a decision once versus repeating it over and over.
Right.
When the World Health Organization has to make this kind of choice, as the Dans and various other people are worried about, they're not worried about the single choice. They're worried about the series of iterations. You make the choice once, seems like the right thing to do. You make the choice a second time, seems like the right thing to do. As I show in my work, as you know, if you make that choice, you iterate it over and over and over, you end up with an outcome that everybody agrees is much worse than the outcome you would have had you not done that at any of the stages. That doesn't mean anything you said was wrong. Your premises are each right, but we do face the real world problem of iteration, which is part of what they're sensitive to and what they want to avoid. And frankly, there is, as you know, no easy answer to that, and this talk just doesn't, by itself, acknowledge that issue.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent comment, and I don't think I want to deny anything that Larry says. Just let me add, to the extent that we face an iteration of the same problem affecting the same group of people repeatedly over and over again, then of course the distinction between intrapersonal and interpersonal aggregative views that I was relying on becomes softened up, right? And take again the speed limit example on the motorway, right? In any given instance, if we take any time slice of the world and say, well, some people died in fatal accidents that day, and look what the others got in return. Something so trivial, they got to work 20 minutes faster. That doesn't seem right to permit something like that. But of course, that isn't the right way to think about this kind of iterated scenario, because over the course of someone's lifetime, they can expect to benefit not once, but a large number of times from the convenience of being able to travel to work faster. And so in these kinds of iterated cases, where the problem affects the same group of people again and again, I think that is something to be taken into consideration. The only difference between those kinds of cases and the treatment versus prevention problem that I was talking about today, I would say, is that for the people currently suffering from AIDS who need treatment now, this isn't an iterated problem, right? If they do not get treatment, they will die, and they're not around to benefit, from prevention measures at the, subsequent iteration of this decision, right? So I think in this respect, the structure of treatment versus prevention cases is disanalogous from something like speed limit cases, because in a speed limit case, people, the same group of people is affected by the same situation over and over again, whereas in the relevant sense for part of the people in treatment versus prevention trade-offs, it's a one-shot decision. So that's my partial response.
All right. Well, listen, I don't want to stop the conversation, but I do think we should continue it over lunch. And so we do have